Good morning, everyone, and thank you for braving the harsh winter, especially in Regina. This is really a snowy morning across the province. I'm really here to welcome you to this Johnson Shoyama Graduate School Public Lecture, Indigenous Policy at the Crossroads, which is presented by our dear friend Ken Coates, who's on the JSGS faculty. The Johnson Shoyama Graduate School of Public Policy is a provincial center for advanced study and research in public policy and administration. The school is the product of a partnership between the University of Regina and the University of Saskatchewan, and was based on the spirit of collaboration and cooperation that defines our beautiful province. At this time, I would like to acknowledge that today's event is taking place on Treaty 4 and here Treaty 6 land and the traditional homeland of the Métis. My name is Daniel Bella, and I'm a Canada Research Chair in Public Policy at the Johnson Shoyama School, and I will be your moderator today. As many of you know, we are one school with two campuses, so I will want to extend our warm welcome to our colleagues and guests at the University of Regina campus. Today, Ken Coates will speak about a most timely topic he knows a lot about. Ken is the Canada Research Chair in Regional Innovation at the Johnson Shoyama Graduate School of Public Policy here at the U of S campus. He's also a Senior Fellow at Macdonald-Laurier Institute, leading their program on Indigenous governance and economic development. He has published widely in the area of Indigenous rights and economic development, and he's the co-author recently of From Treaty People to Treaty Nation, a Roadmap for All Canadians. So we are pleased to have you, Ken, here with us today, and we'll let you, of course, speak about Indigenous policy at the Crossroads, and then we'll entertain questions from both campuses. Please extend our welcome to Ken Coates.
Great, thanks, Daniel, and thank you, folks in Regina. Great to have you with us, folks here. Thank you for coming out in the snow. We're just proving how tough we are as Canadians, which is always really good to see. The topic is topic is there. It also says the 5th of May, so I'm just showing this as a warm-up drill for my real talk, which will come a couple of months from now. So I'm just doing this thing late last night. The topic here, I think, is one of great importance to Canada for reasons that I'll explain as we sort of go along in the next 40 minutes or so. I want to go back over a little bit to sort of set the stage and then talk about where we sort of sit at this particular juncture. But, you know, analysts and historians in particular are always great at thinking about things as crossroads or turning points or tipping points, and everything is always a pivotal moment, so we got to focus on what's happening right now. But actually, I believe it this time. And I believe it for two reasons. One is, if the current government gets this right, we are going down a very, very different path, a very different trajectory, one of hope and considerable optimism. If the current government and all the other partners, including Indigenous peoples, provincial authorities, and every private sector and public at large, get it wrong, I think we could find ourselves in some real difficulty in the years to come. Because Aboriginal folks have been waiting a long time. It goes back before Confederation, back before 1867. It's been a persistent, consistent problem ever since that time. We've had Aboriginal people marginalized in every way you could possibly imagine. It is, in one sense, the greatest example of public policy failure in Canadian history. It should be a reminder to all of us here at the Johnson Shoyama Graduate School that public policy can be a force for great good, and it can be a source of unmitigated disaster. And those disasters are very seldom distributed equtably. When a government gets its policy wrong, usually somebody, some group, some area, some region, some identifiable, social group pays the price, oftentimes in a very, very bad sort of way. And so when you say here that we're at an impasse or at a crossroads and thinking about where we're going, it really does raise some fascinating questions about what's going on in Canada right at this moment. We're going to look at the current government's approach and consider sort of some of the meaning and significance that we sort of go along with this. I'm perplexed by where we are right now, to be honest, because one of the things that just astonishes me in Canada is we love to tell the world how generous we are with Indigenous peoples. Actually, it's been a standard sort of part of our narrative as a country. And if you go back into even the late 19th century, Canadians would often write in their histories and in their political observations that, well, things haven't worked out so well for Aboriginal folks, but we sure weren't as bad as the Americans. The Americans had Geronimo, and they had Sitting Bull, and they had the U.S. Cavalry, and George Custer, and they had the Battle of Little Bighorn. They had all these nasty things that happened. The Trail of Tears, the movement of groups from Georgia and over to Oklahoma, massive dislocations and harm done to Indigenous folks. And we sort of reached over and patted ourselves on the back really hard and congratulated ourselves for sending the Northwest Mounted Police instead of the Canadian Army. People who were wise noticed that we actually didn't have a real Canadian Army, so you couldn't have done that anyway. The budget of the U.S. Army in Western United States was larger than Canada's entire budget in the 1870s. So we couldn't have afforded what they called Indian Wars at the time. It was a sort of a very different sort of approach. But if you actually look and say here what I call the trajectory of Indigenous and treaty rights, the reality of it is that most of our emphasis on Indigenous and treaty rights is a sort of a development of the last 40 years. And I just want everybody to remember two things. Number one is that the government of Canada and the political legal process in this country has given Aboriginal folks basically nothing. They've fought for every single thing, every major development that's occurred in terms of an expansion of Indigenous rights, recognition of Indigenous rights, the development of the modern recognition of treaty rights, came out of concerted and systematic Indigenous protest and Indigenous agitation. My favorite example, I was talking to folks in northern British Columbia one time, one of the chiefs, and these are the Gitxaałtziwet'en people. They had a major court case in the 1980s that went all the way to the Supreme Court, and first time to identify sort of the concept of Indigenous rights and the value of oral tradition in explaining the rights that Indigenous people had to their territories. And he was really mad. I mean, he calmed down. It only took him 40 years, but he calmed down. And he was really mad at the time. And I said, well, why are you so agitated? You won. You won this thing. He said, not once did the government of British Columbia hold a bake sale to pay their lawyers. And they were actually, government of British Columbia spent millions of dollars fighting First Nations people. First Nations people didn't have $1 million. It cost them way more than that. But they actually had to stop housing projects, cancel language programs, take money away from elders initiatives in order to fight the government of Canada, not just once, not just twice, but all the way to the Supreme Court of Canada, where they finally won a partial victory in that particular case. There's two ways of looking at this. We've had, in the case of Indigenous peoples and the court and the resource economy, on the one hand, people say Aboriginal folks have won 200 consecutive cases. It's not quite true. They've won more than 200, but they've lost a few in the middle. But just look at a number and say, there's 200, 250 court cases. And then you look and say, isn't that great? They're winning. And then you sit there and think, that means they had to go to court 250 times to basically claim what is actually pretty clear in the law as it is. In other words, they're fighting for tiny increments and tiny clarifications in the process and spending millions upon millions of dollars. Every time you hear of a case going to the Supreme Court, I'm just reminded of the fact that lawyers basically tell you it costs $1 million to take a case to the Supreme Court. And so you look at all the money, all the time, all the community effort that's gone into that. So the other way of looking at this is to say, we have had treaties since the 1870s, starting in Western Canada. We've had, including for First Nations and for Métis people, particularly in Northern Ontario. We've had treaty processes, largely honoured in the breach. They were not respected as really foundational documents. They were just ways of clearing the West for settlement, and we sort of started down that track in a fairly systematic sort of way. But 1965, just to give you a bit of a sense, in 1965, two men, Aboriginal men on Vancouver Island, White and Bob, went to court, were charged actually with hunting deer out of season. Now, why would they do that? Well, the answer was two things. One, they were hungry. That's a good reason. Secondly, they'd always had. This was just something Aboriginal folks did. They managed the resource carefully. They never over-harvested, and they had the right to do this. And they got caught, and they were charged. And went all the way to the Supreme Court. The White and Bob case, 1965. This is our Thomas Berger. You may have heard the name Thomas Berger. Thomas Berger went from being sort of a labor lawyer into becoming an Indigenous rights advocate. So in 1965, which for most of the people in this room and in Regina was well before you were born, but it wasn't. I was a young guy then. Aboriginal people were fighting for the right to use the land that they lived on, in the case of British Columbia, for 8,000 years. And they were having to go to court and spend huge amounts of money to get the right to harvest the deer their ancestors have used for generation upon generation upon generation. The Sparrow decision, which everybody says, oh, look, this is where Aboriginal people were empowering themselves through these great legal battles, was the right to fish for food and ceremonial purposes. In other words, the right to fish for salmon for exactly the same thing they've been using salmon for thousands of years. So these rights, when we talk about Indigenous rights, remember how recent most of them are. Right? And Aboriginal people don't have the right to vote in federal elections until 1960. So most of the things we take for granted have actually come along really in the last 40 years. And every one of them involved a huge amount of Aboriginal organization, a huge amount of Aboriginal fundraising, a huge commitment of their resources. Just to use one example, you may have heard of the Chilcotin decision, which was the first major decision in Canadian history to really recognize the Indigenous title to traditional lands. It came out in 2014. It's only been around for a short little while. I've actually worked on that case as an expert witness. The Chilcotin is a very small group of people in the north, so the central part of British Columbia, west of Williams Lake, about 300 kilometers west of Williams Lake, down a gravel road. Beautiful, beautiful territory. These very poor communities, roughly it's the same as sort of La Loche or Fond du Lac or one of these, Peter Ballantyne Creek First Nation, these small places. They fought. They spent probably $15 million fighting. They won, but the victory wasn't as big as they thought. It was a fairly narrow victory. It was right over certain very specific territories. But that's only 4 years ago that Indigenous peoples were celebrating the recognition. They had never signed a treaty. In the case of the Chilcotin, they had never signed a treaty. There's unceded land. They had actually deliberately kept non-Aboriginal people away for decades upon decades. The Hudson's Bay Company arrived, I love this story. Hudson's Bay Company arrived and said, listen, we're going to set up a fur trade post right in your territory. You don't have to walk anymore. We'll do it for you. And they said, nope, go away. And they said, well, it's much easier. We'll bring all the supplies out here and we'll set up a post. And they said, no, it's our territory. Buzz off. And they did that for 80 years. In fact, it was one of the only massacres of Indian people, Aboriginal people, sort of massacring non-Aboriginal people, was actually the Chilcotin War in the 1860s. Because they said they were planning a railway right through their territory. And they said, buzz off. We do not want you in this land. So the experience of the trajectory of Indigenous and treaty rights, even though they have deep historical roots, are very present. They're basically within my lifetime, within most of your lives. It's really only been the last 20 years that we've really seen a sharp clarification of Indigenous rights. The other thing I'll say about this is that the pattern generally is that when Indigenous people do not have very many rights, the non-Aboriginal population supports Indigenous rights, and that as they gain rights, the support goes down. In other words, as long as you're claiming rights, you will help you, but as soon as you get them and they interfere with our economic development plan or our constitutional changes, we're going to find this very, very frustrating. And we live this in part in Saskatchewan, the Prairie West generally, where we're seeing sort of an upsurge of anti-Indigenous sentiment in different parts of the province at different times. The other part here to note is the Indigenous Expectations. There's one thing to talk about the abstract of what are treaty and Aboriginal rights, and we'll go through that a little bit and discover that we still don't know in full. We know what they might be, but we don't know in detail what they are. But it is also important to recognize that the Indigenous folks have very clear understandings. The treaties were essentially the start of a partnership. They were not designed as a sort of a once-and-for-all time, finish this exercise and get it all done. If you actually look at the way the treaties were signed, Indigenous peoples were not doing very well on the prairies. They were being dislocated by farmers. The railway was sort of planned. It wasn't under construction at this time. The buffalo were dying off because of American overhunting. Indigenous peoples expected the treaties to be a foundation for lasting partnership. They expected that the land would be shared, the resources would be shared, and the prosperity in the future would be shared. And that as one part of the population, the farming population, grew in prosperity, that the benefits would actually flow to all. They thought the treaties would be modified as time went on. They'd be clarified and modernized. Did not expect that their rights would be limited and defined really by the Government of Canada through the Department of Indian Affairs. It's really worth noting, Section 35 of the Constitution, 1982, recognized and affirmed existing Aboriginal and treaty rights. I'm not sure how much of this stuff is on YouTube because it wasn't invented back then, but there's some wonderful First Ministers conferences. And if you actually watch the tapes from those times, they're really amazing, because you can hear the premiers, particularly in Saskatchewan, Alberta, Manitoba. Peter Lougheed was one of the more stronger supporters of this, but after him it became a sharp drop-off. They were basically saying, well, we can't put in Aboriginal rights into the Constitution because we don't know what they are. We haven't defined what an Aboriginal right is. We haven't defined what a treaty right is, and so that's way too open-ended. And I remember hearing, some of the Aboriginal leaders like Ovid Mercredi saying, please define for me freedom of speech. Please define for me equality of women. And a long list of all the things in our Charter of Rights that aren't defined and that are still being debated and still a source of legal contention at the time. But they managed to get it through. And that by itself was a very important sort of achievement as you went along. Then Aboriginal folks discovered that even if they had recognition of existing Aboriginal and treaty rights in the Constitution, they still had to fight to have it acknowledged. So the government didn't sit down and say, hey, let's look at our laws and let's look at our regulations and let's change what we do to fit better with existing Aboriginal and treaty rights. They basically left it for claimants to come forward and say, we have a right to fish, we have a right to cut down trees, we have a right to fish for eels for commercial purposes in the Maritimes. And case after case after case after case. In the natural resource sector alone, hundreds of them. There are currently, just as a small example of this, I was invited to a meeting in Ottawa at one time with the Minister of Justice from New Zealand. And he was sitting down at a table with all the deputy ministers with responsibilities in the Indigenous file. And he said, I only have one question for you. He said, what's your contingent liability on Indigenous affairs? He looks around, what do you mean by contingent? Well, you probably know what this means. It means if you lost all of your cases, how much would you owe? And what we discovered in the course of the conversation, the Deputy Minister of Justice was there and the Deputy Minister of Indian Affairs was there. They actually didn't even have a list of how many cases there were. Because they were in all sorts of different files, a transportation issue over here and a housing issue over there, and Indigenous funding issue on another side. Nobody knew how many cases there were. There are thousands of them now. At the time, the contingent liabilities was in the tens of millions of dollars, but nobody knew it. Nobody had actually added it up. We have major court cases going through. There's one thing coming close to a settlement in James Bay that will probably be a $2 billion settlement. Another one, a case in Nunavut, arising to modern treaty settlements, will be over $1 billion. There are hundreds of these things going sort of through the process. And the Supreme Court, interestingly, on the one hand, they've been accused of judicial activism because they've made a whole series of decisions that have changed the nature of the relationship. One of the most important was in 2004. The Haida and the Taku people in northwest, the Taku River, in the northwest corner of British Columbia, basically said resource development was happening without their approval. And they came up, the Supreme Court did, with what they called the duty to consult and accommodate. Essentially said you cannot develop resources on Aboriginal land unless you've spoken to the Aboriginal people and have their, not using the word consent, but you've consulted with them, and if there are problems, you've compensated them for it. So if 5 people are going to lose their trap lines, you have to provide some financial compensation or jobs or something else that will actually ensure that the benefits are sort of fairly widely shared. That was 2004. In the mining sector, we now have about 300 to 400, it varies a little bit, duty to consult and accommodate agreements across the country. In the forestry sector, we have over 1,000 duty to consult and accommodate kind of agreements that are sparked out of this whole process. We have one of the most extensive collaborations of Indigenous people in the resource sector. You think the opposite based on what the media talks about Kinder Morgan protests and occasional protests in the rest of the country. But in fact, there are hundreds upon hundreds of Indigenous communities working with the resource companies because the resource companies have to work with them. So the Supreme Court has clarified the rights. They've expanded them into different areas and different territories. It's complicated now by groups like the Human Rights Tribunals that have actually made some decisions. If you haven't followed the career of Cindy Blackstock, she's done an amazing job at drawing attention to the massive shortcomings in social services, the underfunding of social services. So the most vulnerable part of our population is supported the least, which is just an irony of tragic significance as we sort of think through this one. And then we have the Liberal Party. I'm not going to make this a partisan conversation. The Tories had some difficulties under the Harper government toward the end of its term. The Tories also had some significant successes. They had a different value system Their value system was empowering local communities. The initial value system of the Liberals was actually addressing socioeconomic problems. So they're actually both of them seeking the same objectives, but doing it in very different sort of ways. But this is kind of interesting on a number of levels. In 2015, Indigenous affairs actually figured a little bit in the federal election because the Liberals kept talking about it. Liberal leader Justin Trudeau, completely out of the blue, he hadn't been talking about this before, made some enormous pronouncements about Indigenous rights, that he was going to make it a big priority, that he was going to adopt the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, that he was going to expand everything and do all sorts of good things. At the time, most observers didn't believe him. It was sort of an easy thing to say. It was a wedge issue because he was trying to say, Harperites were doing this bad stuff and we're going to do this good stuff. And we really didn't have a sense of how serious the Trudeau Party, the Trudeau Liberal Party was. What we did see, and this was highly significant, was Indigenous people said, this is the most promising political sort of set of commitments we've heard in generations. So we're going to get involved in the election. And you might know that Aboriginal folks are massively underrepresented in the census. They don't trust the census data. They often don't fill them in. But they also don't vote very large numbers in provincial and federal elections, partly because they say it's a nation-to-nation relationship. We'll vote for our own elections, in First Nations, Métis, Inuit elections, but we're not going to vote in public government sort of elections. This time they did. And they did so because they thought, these folks are serious. These folks keep saying the same thing over and over and over again. And they took Indigenous people took the Liberal Party more seriously than others, in part because of a whole series of conversations that were going on behind closed doors, sort of in the background, saying, actually, we will make this one of our top priorities. So if you can read these online, if you go to the mandate letters for the different ministers, Indigenous Affairs shows up in everybody's mandate letter. Government of Canada under Justin Trudeau said this would be essentially the defining theme of the Liberal government's mandate, the first mandate. They wanted to make the building of a new, what they called a nation-to-nation relationship, an absolute top-notch priority for the Government of Canada. And they weren't really, nobody really expected it would be that strong. The Indigenous leadership did, because they'd been told it was coming. But the public as a whole didn't really understand how seriously he was going to take it. It's worth noting as well, the Prime Minister established a personal presence in Indigenous communities. His father had done the same thing. Pierre Trudeau had done the same thing. Jean Chrétien had done the same thing. Canadian Prime Ministers and Canadian Ministers of Indian Affairs love to go to Indigenous communities and go snowmobiling. They love to be up there and be seen in these communities. They love to go up north because it's so exotic compared to Toronto, which is really boring. And they wanted to go to all these places and did all these interesting things. This Prime Minister showed up over and over and over again. Very shortly after he was elected, he went and addressed the entire Assembly of First Nations in their sort of general meeting. And it was like, wow, Prime Minister came here, started apologizing, started promising, we're going to do it better, we're going to do all sorts of interesting kinds of things. They made a bit of a goof up with the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People. This was signed in 2007. The Harper government acknowledged it, signed on to it effectively in 2010. The Harper government signed on because they were convinced by Indigenous leaders that it was an aspirational document. In other words, it wasn't a text designed for legislative purposes. And if any of you have read the United Declaration, it's a very sweeping document that essentially says the non-Indigenous peoples of the world have to reset their entire relationship with Indigenous peoples. And it's very comprehensive. In North America, we sort of focus on one or two things, mostly about free, prior, and informed consent, about the role in resource development. There's language there about education, about healthcare, about mobility. There's language there about democratic participation. There's a whole about the right to their own cultures and traditions and traditional harvesting rights. It's a massive, important document. So what happened is during the election, Prime Minister, during and after the election, Prime Minister Trudeau said, we will adopt the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People. 6 months later, Jody Wilson, who was the Minister of Justice, is the Minister of Justice, said, we're not going to adopt it. It's too complicated. It's basically aligning this with Canadian laws would be confusing, would basically upset some of our existing Supreme Court decisions. They would also perhaps upset some other parts of the Canadian political process, including modern treaties, and maybe even historic treaties. So we still love the spirit of it, but we're going to back away from it. 6 months after that, they came back and said, no, we're going to do it now. And said, we figured out a way. They had a really big group of people working on this in Ottawa. And they basically said, can we align Canadian law and Canadian practice with the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples? So the answer was yes, then the answer was no, and then the answer again was, yeah, we think we can. Although, if you look at what they're doing, there's now a private member's bill going through the House that essentially calls on Canada to do this. If you look at the liberal language they're using, they're talking about words like align rather than sort of adopt in full. So they'll basically try to get Canadian legislation and law to actually align with the draft declaration, or call it draft declaration, with the Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. We also have a bit of an interesting piece here. In my estimation, in a public government sense, the most powerful Indigenous political leader in Canadian history is Jody Wilson-Raybould. She's a former regional chief of the Assembly of First Nations representing British Columbia. Her father, Bill Wilson, was a firebrand. Not a word we use very much anymore, but extremely outspoken and very aggressive, and he scared the willies out of British Columbians because he kept talking about, this is we own the whole thing, it's our territory, and we have the right to everything. And she's a bit less outspoken, but very cagey and very talented. She basically is driving a lot of the Indigenous policy in Ottawa. And to actually have an Indigenous person in a profile like Minister of Justice, and they're in a position to do all these things, is really, really quite outstanding. So now it's 2015, it's 2016, we're into 2017 now. Sort of what's happening? What's actually going on in terms of these developments? I mean, are the great words from here actually showing up in practice? Well, we actually get, and I'm afraid this is hard to see, but this is in the summer of 2017, they came up with principles respecting the Government of Canada's relationship with Indigenous peoples. It's a lovely phrase. There's 10 principles that are there. There's another page I'll show you really quickly. This is a really interesting document that only policy wonks can get excited about because it's not much poetry here. But it's really important from their point of view, from the government's point of view, saying, we will take these principles and we will look at all legislation that we get involved with and make sure that it adheres to these principles. In other words, they no longer wanted Indigenous affairs tucked over in the Indigenous Affairs Department, what used to be Department of Indian Affairs. We actually wanted to cover everything that we do, and that it'll become one of the first principles we use in sort of looking at what's going on in Canada. Recognition of right to self-determination, including the inherent right of self-government. That's a huge, big thing. The idea that Aboriginal people should control their own affairs. We've had a paternalistic colonial model in Canada for a long time. It's still very much in presence. Basically, Government of Canada said we're going to get away from that. We're going to let Indigenous people control their own affairs. Constitution, Section 35 is recognized. The honour of the Crown guides the conduct of the Crown and all of its dealings with Indigenous people. That's a really interesting one. Basically, what it means is the Crown is obligated to act honourably in the interests of Indigenous people and the Government of Canada. I'll give you an example of this. And I'll use British Columbia rather than the federal government in this particular instance. In the Chilcotin case, just to use that one for instance, the government of British Columbia's main argument was that Chilcotin did not exist as a people. Now, the Chilcotin could trace their ancestry in their own land back about 5,000, 6,000, 7,000 years. After you get past 2, it's kind of, sort of just stretches out to what they call time immemorial. And so in the court case, which was at that time the longest court case in the history of the British Commonwealth, the government of British Columbia spent an enormous amount of time going through each one of its experts on the stand and trying to get them to admit that the Chilcotin did not exist as an organized society. And as the chief at the time sort of said, after he was in there being grilled for hours upon hours upon hours, he basically says, the government of British Columbia thinks we're all dogs. That we're just wandering around with no human organization, no social structure, no value, no constitution, no political system or structures, no spiritual core. And the Aboriginal folks found this unbelievably offensive. In other words, in their view, my view, the Crown was acting dishonorably. It was not doing respectful sort of attention to its rights and opportunities in the way. Just continuing down the principles that Indigenous self-government is a cooperative federalism. that in fact Indigenous affairs fit in with the rest of the Canadian system, which is a great and important part of this whole process. And it recognizes the treaties, agreements, and other constructive arrangements as acts of reconciliation. That, in other words, the role of government was to actually reconcile the relationship with Indigenous and non-Indigenous peoples. And you'll remember before the election of Liberals in 2015, we had the report of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. Earlier, we had the Royal Commission on Aboriginal People. We've been at this for a long time, trying to figure out what's wrong with the Indigenous relationship in Canada. And we discovered that just about everything's wrong with it. There aren't very many good positive parts. But just to go through the other principles, they do talk about the free, prior, and informed consent. This implies basically on resource and land. That's picking up on the core concept of the UNDRIP, the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. There's an interesting question here where it says about respecting and implementing rights is essential, and any infringement of that right has to be carefully done. In the Chilcotin decision, they said that Aboriginal people had sovereignty over their traditional territories, but that the federal government still had ultimate say, or the provincial government, depending on what they were doing in those areas. And what the interesting thing here is, the court said, you have to tell people upon what basis you're going to overrule Indigenous rights. And that's what this document is this part of this principle is saying, is we will explain that the bar is very high. In other words, it's the last thing we'll want to do. We exercise eminent domain all the time. We intercede on top of privately held lands and municipal lands and whatever. We do that a lot. The point here is that with Indigenous affairs, you have to do it very, very carefully, with very high level of justification. The flip side of this is that for many years, the government used Indigenous lands with the lowest level of justification. If they wanted it, they just took it, going back into the World War I and even back into the 19th century. Basically, an acknowledgement of the need for new fiscal relationships. The reconciliation wasn't an event, but a process. It was going to take a long time to sort of get right. And then they also realized that Indigenous people are not all First Nations. There's First Nations folks, Métis folks, Inuit folks, different rights, different expectations that had to be taken into account on a systematic basis. So here's we get to some of the problems start to occur. If you ask a lot of Indigenous leaders in Canada how this is all working out, they basically will say, we're tired of promises. We've had lots of promises. Now, in a larger pattern of Canadian political history, the 2.5 years since the election of the Liberal government in October of 2015 isn't a very long time. And, federal policy is a huge, big ship. It's like, taking a huge, big tanker and turning it around. You don't move it very quickly. It moves very, very slowly. But Mr. Trudeau has made so many comments about what was going to happen that there's a growing level of frustration about the fact that things haven't happened as quickly as possible. And why is that? The primary reason is that Indigenous communities, even as they are making great economic strides in the private sector, resource development, economic development corporations, lots of good and positive things are actually happening in the Indigenous world. And a level of self-government and modern treaties, these are all, compared to the 1960s, absolutely transformative. Put this in one context. I don't think there's anybody in the country alive in 1970 who realistically forecast the kind of developments that have occurred by 2018. At that time, Aboriginal communities were still controlled by the Indian agent. The Department of Indian Affairs was still very powerful. The courts were moving very, very slowly. There was no constitutional recognition. Nobody back in 1970 was saying, "Oh, give us 30 years and we'll have all these things happen." So lots of interesting things are happening, but they aren't changing a lot of the fundamentals. Indigenous peoples have one of the highest, if not the highest, teenage suicide rate in the world. The level is absolutely staggering. The opiate crisis in northern Indigenous communities is mind-boggling. It's so intense and so comprehensive. You have huge problems with teenage pregnancy. You have serious problems with HIV. In the budget, there's this really small announcement, and I can't remember how much it was. I'm going to say it was $50 million. Don't quote me on that. For tuberculosis control. Say what? Tuberculosis control? Tuberculosis is a serious problem. It is a disease of poverty caused by overcrowding. caused by mold and things like that in the poor air circulation in the homes. We have a national epidemic of tuberculosis going around Indigenous communities. Absolutely staggering. If you pay any attention at all to the missing and murdered Aboriginal women's sort of process, you'll discover that violence is a very significant part of Indigenous women's lives, a horrifically significant part, statistically overwhelmingly significant part of their lives. And it's really fascinating when the thing was coming down. I remember reading all these comments saying, don't those Indigenous women know that most of the violence is caused by men, Indigenous men, and by people they know, brothers, fathers, sisters, spouses, boyfriends, or whatever else? And the Aboriginal woman said, they said bad things. Yes, we know. We want it to stop. That's the whole point. We want to figure out what's behind it and how do you correct from that. So the problem is the promises are here, up high, growing higher almost every time the Prime Minister speaks, and the problem is that the problems are kind of intractable. And you have lots of communities that, I don't even know what the official unemployment rate is, but sometimes they'll say, oh, this community has a 25% unemployment rate. Well, it has about 60% of people who stop looking. They're out of the workforce. So the actual effective unemployment rate is in 75, 80, 90%. Because these are communities separated from the market economy and there's not much going on in the area. And so if you look at fundamental issues, why are we still having a water crisis controversy? In 2006, Saskatchewan had a water crisis that actually caused a widespread disease in their community. And we had huge promises from the then governments and subsequent governments, we're going to bring in fresh water. Why haven't we done that? It's cost a lot of money. Yeah, but so does constant disease and all the other difficulties and things going on. We have a housing crisis of staggering proportions. And some of you may remember when the forest fire went through a couple of years ago in northern Saskatchewan, they were interviewing a chief from one of the communities. And the chief was sort of asked, you're standing in front of a fourplex. And the journalist comes and says, you have to find room for 4 families in this because the room was 4 of the fourplex. And the fellow says, the chief, very quiet guy, says, 12. And he said, you mean there were 12 people? 3 people per family. He said, 12 families. 12 families in a fourplex. And if you want to think of the implications of this for health, sleeping patterns, education, right, and the damage to the buildings. Buildings designed for 4 people that have 12 or 15 people living in them will fall apart. They don't care who's living in them. It's not an Indigenous issue, it's an overcrowding issue. So the gap between sort of the growing list of promises and the fact that life in the communities is not increasing dramatically. And yet we get all these announcements every year of $300 million for this and $500 million for that. And if you follow really closely, at the end of the year, oftentimes the money hasn't been spent. Ottawa has real difficulty getting stuff out the door. Why? Because most of these are remote communities. If you decided today that you wanted to build a house in most northern communities, it's actually too late to reserve space on the barges for this summer. So what you have to do is reserve space for another whole year. So if you decided today to build a house in one of these Fond du Lac, one of the communities in northern Saskatchewan, you might not be able to have it built for 18 months or longer. Right? And that's if you can get tradespeople to work in these areas and what have you. The government has made some very significant moves. I'm very impressed with the restructuring of Indigenous affairs. Basically what they've done is created 2 departments. Crown Indigenous Relations and Northern Affairs is one. And that's Carolyn Bennett is the minister of that one. And Jane Philpott is the Minister of Indigenous Services. The idea was to take the conceptual relationship and put it over here, and the service side where we have some huge problems, particularly on social services. The budget included hundreds of millions of dollars more for social service care in that area. We've got some interesting sort of transitions on resource development. One of the ones, it's fascinating to sort of think about how this happened. In January 2017, along with President Obama, just as Obama was leaving office, he declared a moratorium on oil and gas exploration off the coast of Alaska. And so Canada did the same thing and declared a moratorium off oil and gas exploration in the Arctic, in this country. The Premier of Nunavut, according to people in Nunavut, was given 2 hours' notice that was happening. The Northwest Territories got less than half an hour's notice that they were going to close this down. So what's the issue here? The Northwest Territories says without oil and gas development, they're going to be broke forever. And they will be a completely government-dependent economy. Their mines, the major mines, are all winding down in the next 5 years. And the government of Canada just took away their economic plan, just completely eliminated it overnight. Nunavut's furious. I actually was sitting in a room in Nunavut last April with a bunch of people talking about how to launch the suit against the federal government that could be for as much as $5 billion. Why? Because duty to consult and accommodate actually goes in all directions. It isn't just when somebody wants to develop traditional territories, it's if you put regulations that stop development in traditional territories. So we're going to see some major court battles over this one, and the government of Canada will probably lose. You can't have duty to consult only when it serves your national interest. It has to be in both sides. We've got an issue here about West Coast tankers. There's some First Nations agitating, not the First Nations so much as individual First Nations people and business leaders. The government of Canada banned tanker traffic off the west coast of British Columbia. Well, British Columbia only has one coast, and it is the west one, but off the coast of British Columbia. And then cancelled the Enbridge Northern Gateway pipeline. There's people really angry about that because the government just assumed they knew what Indigenous people wanted, rather than actually going and talking to them and thinking about the duty to consult and accommodate peace. Most recently, and only last month, they came up with a very important statement in the House of Commons. It's only 15 minutes. You can listen to it. Easy to follow. Very wonderful language. This is the Prime Minister Trudeau at his rhetorical best. You'll notice that Jody Wilson-Raybould was there to give him a really quick hug right afterwards. She probably wrote it, or at least had a major hand in it. It's a framework on the recognition and implementation of Indigenous rights. This is the potential ground changer. It's going to shift the foundation of Indigenous rights in Canada. One of the things they want to do in Ottawa is change the pattern of litigation. They want to look for ways of resolving through mediation or through some other mechanisms the constant sort of recourse to the courts, which takes a huge amount of money. By the way, when an Aboriginal group spends $10 million on a court case, as the Chilcotin did, and the government of British Columbia probably spent 20, and the government of Canada probably spent 10 to 15. Right? So the Indigenous people are overwhelmed by the money that other agencies can actually put into the place. They want to change this. They want to change the basic way of how you recognize and acknowledge Indigenous rights, what structures you have, what consultations you have. And you'll notice just a small example that you won't perhaps see connected to this. When the government last year was having discussions on climate change, this is sort of a follow-up to Paris and what are we going to do about the climate change things. The First Nations and Inuit and Métis people said, we want to be consulted on this. So they went out to Vancouver, and when they got there, they discovered that the premiers were going to talk to the Prime Minister at a later meeting, and the Indigenous folks were going to talk to the Prime Minister at the first meeting. And the Indigenous people came very close to walking out entirely. Some of them did. Some of them went to the meeting, and they were really upset about this, saying, consultation doesn't mean you stick us in the corner and talk to us like we're children. It means we're part of the political process. And that means we should be engaged all the way along. This is what's at stake here. And just to use an example, in Norway, the Sami people have a parliament. It is not a sort of empowered parliament in the same way our parliament is, but actually runs parallel. So any laws or regulations that are believed to have an impact on Sami people actually have to go through the Sami parliament for extensive consultation that then come meet at the top, at which point the government of Norway sometimes ignores them, particularly on mining issues and things like that. But nonetheless, there are other models out there of how you can actually negotiate with Indigenous peoples, have them participate in the process. And then reality hits. The bumps I've indicated here are Colton Boucher in Saskatchewan, Tina Fontaine in Manitoba. Don't underestimate the significance of these cases. There's another one that just happened the other day of an Indigenous person who was run down on the side of the road in New Brunswick. And they're pressing the government of the police to sort of do something about it right away and to sort of put more effort into it and treat it as a serious issue. These debates, the Colton Boucher one was quite fascinating because both the Minister of Justice and the Prime Minister actually sent out a tweet saying their sympathy was with the Colton Boucher family, and a huge backlash from some lawyers who thought this was offensive, from some non-Indigenous people who thought it was offensive. Put your faith in the legal process. Both the Prime Minister and the Minister of Justice were saying, we know this is shaking your faith in the legal process. We're going to have to, going back to here, figure out how to deal with this. If you look at the overrepresentation of Indigenous people in the courts and in the prisons, it is of staggering proportions. Absolutely staggering proportions. And if you look further at the people, particularly the men who are in those penitentiaries, the vast majority, probably half of them or more, don't know how much the exact percentage, actually have mental health issues, serious mental health issues. And we're using the prison system to deal with mental health issues, which is far from the right thing to do. But what's interesting is, even as promises were piling on top of promises, we have these sort of two reminders of the real reality of life for Indigenous folks in Canada, and it is an important reminder that all is far from well. But in the middle of all of this, just two last quick things, I think we're seeing some really important changes. This is the one I think is the most fundamental, what I call the co-production of policies and priorities. I think we're getting past the point where the Government of Canada sat around the cabinet table and decided what was right for Indigenous peoples. And there's lots and lots of evidence that nobody ever talks about because you're not supposed to know what's going on. Lots of evidence that this is actually happening now. That as the government's putting together its budgets, it's asking Aboriginal people what are their priorities. As they're looking at major policy initiatives like the division of the Department of Indigenous Affairs into two departments, that these came out of consultations with Indigenous peoples. Kind of a hard thing to do because the Assembly of First Nations, by definition, is an advocacy organization. It isn't a government. It doesn't have those government functions. The Métis have some significant representation issues. I think it's a gentle way to put it, across the country. Who represents who? And there are groups like non-status Indians and the Inuit, some of whom say we don't need this because we have none of it, and so we can operate within a sort of our own territorial entity. But we are actually seeing a situation where Indigenous peoples are gaining a real say in the way in which government operates. And for this government and this Prime Minister in particular, this is very serious. And the co-production is a really neat model in the sense that you'll notice even when bad things happen, when there's controversies, you'll notice for the last year and bit that the Indigenous leadership has actually been quite quiet. They haven't been piling on top of government as they used to do. They gave us $1 billion, we needed $2 billion. And I think in large part it's because they knew it was coming. They kind of knew how much it was. They knew where the money was going to go. I'm sure there's cabinet secrecy that had to be honored and stuff in the other way. But there has been more engagement with Indigenous people than we've ever seen on the development of federal government policy relating to Indigenous folks. I should add really quickly, by the way, that the role model for this is actually the Yukon, Northwest Territories, and Nunavut. The three Northern Territories are doing this on a daily basis. Sandy Silver was elected about 2 months after Prime Minister Trudeau as the leader of the Liberal Party in the Yukon. His first thing was to meet with each one of the 14 Yukon First Nations, and then to meet with them all as a group. And he meets with them on a regular basis and essentially discusses the government policies and priorities for the coming year in very open manner. And so it's changing the way in which policy is made and making sure Indigenous peoples are front and center. It's hard to do. Not everybody's good at listening to Indigenous peoples. A lot of folks actually listen, but they're not good at it, or they listen and they go away and do something else. If you're actually going to do co-production of policy, it means you actually involve folks in the decision-making process and the taking of responsibility for it. So just to use one example of this, it's going to be quite interesting. In the in the statement the Prime Minister made, a framework statement, and in the last budget, they indicated the Government of Canada would like to see Indigenous groups organized on a regional basis. Instead of the 630-plus First Nations negotiating with Ottawa directly, the government has made it clear they would rather have groups come in a concentrated way. Best example in Canada, the James Bay Cree and the Inuit of Northern Quebec, who actually do collaborative governance within the region. Obviously, Inuit does it as well. But there's actually a real push on to get Indigenous groups to say, figure out a way to organize yourselves. It might be on cultural lines. It might be the Plains Cree getting together. It might be on geographic lines. It might be the First Nations of Northern Ontario or Northwestern Ontario, Northeastern Ontario. Who knows how it's going to work out. But they have basically said, in return for being part of this production process, you have to organize your affairs more effectively. We will grant self-government, but we don't want to grant it to every single First Nation independently. You got to remember that about half of the First Nations in Canada have under 1,000 people. These are small communities, small populations, and a real challenge in that regard. But do always remember something here, and that's this is the sad part again, is that when there's the cost of indecision and inaction is felt almost overwhelmingly by the Indigenous people. That when things get delayed for another year or another 2 years, I don't know how in this country we have the stomach for listening to more examples of epidemic suicides. There are communities in North Australia, Nunavut, that had 12 suicide attempts in a single month. The numbers are absolutely staggering. And we don't know the extent of fetal alcohol syndrome, which is related to the consumption of drugs and alcohol at early stages of pregnancy, and the kind of long-term, life-changing and sad difficulties that ensue from those kind of situations. So, the problem is that we're spending more money. We're not really picking up the speed very much. We're not doing the dramatic things on basics, the housing, the water, the education kind of things. They're moving along very, very slowly. And it's important for all of us to remember that it's the Indigenous folks who pay the price of this as we go along. Let me just wrap up with this last observation on where we're sort of going. I think we spend an awful lot of our time as governments and as people in Canada fighting the symptoms rather than the cause. And so I'll say something that I hope makes us all feel very, very uncomfortable. The lived experience of Indigenous peoples is defined by racism. It does not mean that every Canadian is a racist or that every single Indigenous person faces racism on a daily basis or a issue-by-issue basis. But anybody who spent any time in this field at all will know that the impact of racism is pervasive. It happens in stores. We've had 3 or 4 examples in Saskatchewan in the last 12 to 16 months of Indigenous people who've been followed around inside a store and sort of accused of stealing stuff for the simple reason that they were Indigenous. My friend was a friend of mine from the Yukon went down in Toronto and said, "How was Toronto?" This is a guy. You'll all notice that I don't dress very fancy. I'm not Michael Atkinson. I sort of dress like a bit of a hillbilly, and it's a Daniel Milan look. I like to call it. He was very dapper. He would always have nice shirts and nice coats and all that kind of stuff and ties and everything like that. And so we were talking about Toronto one time, and he said, "You realize that I have not been," he's been there for 3 years, "every single month I've been stopped by the police at least once on the street." So how many times have you been stopped? 0. I'm a tall, white, middle-class looking Canadian who isn't very aggressive, bit of a pussycat, right? No police officers ever pulled me on the side of the street. "What are you doing here? Why are you here at 10 o'clock at night?" Because he was well-dressed, he got stopped more often as an Aboriginal person. They thought he was a drug runner or a drug dealer or something like that. Racism is actually the issue that we don't want to talk about. We always want to talk about the symptoms. We're going to fix the water. We're going to fix the housing. We're going to fix this. We're going to fix that. Nowhere near enough conversation about how you deal with racism as a whole. And interestingly, as Canada becomes a more urban environment, we're moving toward a city-state economy where we're only going to have 6 economies in this country and a bunch of declining cities. That's just the trajectory that we're on as a nation. It's actually the small towns where people have direct interaction with Indigenous peoples. The urban centers, not so much, which is interesting. Although Greater Toronto area has more Indigenous people than the Yukon and Northwest Territories combined. You'd never guess. You think of all the Indigenous stuff up north, and yet Toronto has a huge concentration. Actually, the problem is they're not concentrated. They're scattered all over the city. Without tackling racism, we're going to be having this conversation 50 years from now. And I think it's interesting. We are seeing some real changes. We are seeing the empowerment of Aboriginal people. We are seeing more regional cooperation. Particularly, the stuff that's happening best is in the north and then working its way down. It's not urban centers that are getting together with a bunch of university faculty making life better. It's actually people living together in small communities that are starting to work things out for the first time. We have to modernize the treaty process. I think we have to redo or rethink the historic treaties. They mean an awful lot to Indigenous people and not very much to non-Indigenous people. We have to create some sort of partnership and understanding in that regard. And we have to finish negotiating the modern treaties as we go along. We have to overcome our fear of empowered Indigenous people. I don't think we're comfortable yet with the idea that Indigenous people will be successful. They'll run their own affairs, run their own companies. When I talk to people who are Aboriginal business leaders, and there are lots of them, the resource economy, ironically, has become the front lines of reconciliation. It isn't happening in the cities. It's happening in forestry camps. It is happening in mining towns. And it's happening through the rapid growth of Indigenous business. Canadian Council of Aboriginal Business has 2,500 Indigenous members. This is a rapidly growing sort of sector of the Canadian economy. When you talk to empowered and powerful Indigenous people who are running corporations worth millions of dollars, they will uniformly tell you that the biggest problem they have is overcoming people's antipathy toward them. That the assumption, if you're a rich Aboriginal person, is you must be a crook. You must be ripping money off from the government or ripping money off from your own First Nation or something. It's hogwash. They're powerful and they're wealthy because they're really good at it. They're in the same way that non-Aboriginal people are good at it. But we have a desire to put them in a little box that says this is where poor people live. And we have to overcome that a great deal. We have one great resource, and it's a powerful one, amazingly influential one, and that's the importance of Indigenous leaders. There's not an Indigenous leader I've ever met who couldn't double their income by getting out of Indigenous politics and public affairs. If these Aboriginal folks just said, I'm going to go off and work for somebody else, Government of Canada, private sector, the banks, doesn't matter who it is, they would do way better. The amount of money being offered, the really good people maybe get 15, 20 job offers a month to go off and make way more money. And interesting, why do they stick there? Why do they stick with their community? It is one of the best examples in a country that's notorious for a lack of commitment. I always think Canada has one of the lowest thresholds for royalty of any country on the planet. Don't ask much of Canadians, and Canadians don't give very much, which is why so many of them live in the United States and migrate down there. Indigenous leaders stick around, and they are spending their lives, at sometimes at great human cost. If you look at the physical toll that Indigenous leadership takes on its leaders, and I hope you will throw away forever the idea that Indigenous chiefs in these First Nations and Inuit communities get paid a lot of money. They don't. Most of them are actually seriously underpaid. But at least they're there. And they're there fighting in ways that you simply do not imagine. I cannot tell you how many meetings I've been in. I was at a meeting up in the Yukon a couple of years ago. And in the middle of the meeting, we had one community lose its one of the last people who spoke its language. I had two other communities had teenage suicides, all the same. They all happened on the same day. And we're sitting here having this wonderful government-oriented, policy-oriented conversation, and one of the chiefs says, I can't do this garbage anymore. I'm going home. My people need me. I've got to be with them. I've got to be ready for funerals. I've got to do all this kind of stuff. And so everybody said, yeah, we have to all go home. And everybody left that afternoon. Doesn't happen very often in non-Indigenous communities. Thankfully, don't want this to be something that has to be experienced in general ways. And we finally just ended up with this last one. We're, I think, starting, and again, the best examples are the Yukon, Northwest Territories, and Nunavut. But we're starting to see this happen in other areas. Ironically, the oil sands area in northern Alberta is working out fairly well in this regard. The forestry sector in northern British Columbia. We're starting to see situations where people realize that Aboriginal folks are not the enemy. That empowering Indigenous people does not come at the cost of the non-Indigenous population. And that when Indigenous peoples are actually empowered, when they get self-government, when they have their own authority, when they're making their own investment decisions, when they're, in the case of many of these communities, buying the hotels, buying the gas stations, we got situations where wealthy First Nations from British Columbia and the Yukon are actually buying companies in northern Saskatchewan and operating them successfully. Then what happens is everybody benefits. And you end up with a more fair society, a more just society, a more equitable society, where you're seeing a growth in Indigenous business, more and more Aboriginal people going to university and college. In 1970, there were about 300 Aboriginal people in Canada's colleges and universities. The number now gets close to 30,000 on an annual basis. Staggering increases in 40 years, 50 years. This is amazing, amazing accomplishment. At some point, we'll cross over this threshold. And we'll all of a sudden realize that actually just working collaboratively with Indigenous people is better for everybody. And the society as a whole benefits, and the people who benefit the most are the Indigenous folks. As we overcome colonialism, cope with being members of a society that has racist elements interwoven within it, and moves off in a new direction. So at the end of the day, I'm very pleased with the major policy initiative of the Liberal government. I'm less pleased with what they call deliverology, which is whether they've actually done the things they said they were going to do. These are hard tasks. Very concerned that Canadians' tolerance for spending more money on Indigenous people is kind of at the end of the rope. I don't think Canadians really want to spend more money, but they probably, to actually make major changes, they'd have to double the amount of money on Indigenous affairs for the next 15 to 20 years. And even then, no guarantees at the other end. These are not easy issues. I don't suggest that they are. Anybody who says they know the exact solutions is wrong, because nobody knows the exact solutions. But the current government is doing some things we haven't done before. And for those of you interested in public policy, which I hope is all of you, one of the things is I would encourage you to watch very carefully for this concept that I call the co-production of policy. if we actually engage Indigenous people in the management of the country, not just the management of Indigenous affairs, but the management of the country as a whole, we could set Canada on a dramatically different trajectory that would actually make this country even better. Thank you.